Flight 1549 initially, like all those other flights for so long, was completely routine and unremarkable for the first 100 seconds. But this very suddenly, and I was aware of it at the time.
January 15th, 2009, US Airways. Flight 1549 lifts off from LaGuardia Airport, New York, with 155 people on board. Barely 90 seconds later, disaster strikes. Both engines roar, then fall silent after colliding with a flock of Canada geese. Flames flicker, smoke rises, and the Airbus A320 begins losing altitude with no power to push it forward. In that frozen instant, a routine climb turns into a terrifying plunge toward one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Moments later, witnesses along Manhattan's west side see something surreal. A jetliner, weighing nearly 170,000 pounds, sits motionless on the surface of the Hudson River, as if it had been placed there by hand. The sight is so unlikely that newspapers and television stations rush to call it a miracle. The world remembers it now as the miracle on the Hudson. Yet behind that miracle stood Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger, a former Air Force fighter pilot with decades of experience, whose steady hands and calm judgment turned a doomed aircraft into a story of survival. How did Flight 1549 avoid the fate that seemed certain? And what secrets still linger in those 90 seconds that changed aviation forever? US Airways. Flight 1549 was never meant to be famous. It was a short, routine hop scheduled for a mid-afternoon departure from LaGuardia Airport to Charlotte, North Carolina. On board were 150 passengers and 5 crew members, the kind of load that filled a cabin with business travelers, families, and commuters moving quietly through the skies. No one imagined this ordinary flight would enter history books. At the controls was Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger. At 57 years old, he was more than just a pilot. He was a veteran with over 40 years of flying experience. He had graduated from the US Air Force Academy, flown F-4 Phantom fighter jets, and then transitioned to commercial aviation, where he became known for his obsession with safety and precision. Beside him sat First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, equally skilled but newer to the Airbus A320. Skiles had just completed his training to qualify on the aircraft, and Flight 1549 was part of his early hands-on runs. The combination was striking. One man with decades of battle-tested judgment, the other bringing fresh eyes and technical sharpness. Barely 90 seconds after leaving the runway, the calm was shattered. A sudden thump echoed through the fuselage, followed by another. Outside the windshield, a flock of Canada geese had crossed the jet's path. At speeds over 200 miles per hour, the birds became catastrophic projectiles. Both engines coughed, sputtered, and within moments went silent. Black smoke curled back from the nacelles. The Airbus A320 was no longer a powered airliner. It was a glider, descending fast over one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Inside the cockpit, Sully's instincts took over. He seized control of the aircraft, steadying it against the sudden loss of thrust. Skiles immediately turned to the emergency checklist, trying to restart the engines. Fuel switches, ignition modes, and restart procedures clicked through in seconds, but the engines refused to come back to life. Then came the chilling words across the radio. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Cactus 1549. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back toward LaGuardia.
Cactus 1539 hit birds, so you've lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
The room inside New York TRACON tensed instantly. Air traffic controllers cleared a path, offering runway 13 at LaGuardia. Seconds later came another option. Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, just across the river. Both were close in geography, but dangerously far in terms of altitude and glide distance. As controllers fired instructions, headings, turns, vectors, the cockpit filled with urgency. Every second lost meant altitude slipping away. Every mile forward meant fewer chances to reach solid ground. It was here, amid the silence of failed engines and the overlapping voices of controllers and checklists, that the stakes crystallized. Sully had to decide: LaGuardia, Teterboro, or something else entirely. And in those tense minutes, a decision unlike any other in modern aviation was about to take shape. The clock was running out. Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger faced the kind of choice pilots train for but almost never encounter in real life. In those fleeting seconds, Sully made the call: the Hudson River. It was a choice almost no one would dare. Water landings, ditching in aviation terms, carry some of the worst odds of survival. History is filled with attempts that ended in chaos: fuselages breaking apart, wings shearing off, cabins filling instantly with water. Very few commercial pilots had ever managed to bring a jet down intact on a river. Yet Sully, drawing on decades of experience, saw in the Hudson his only chance. As the Airbus A320 glided silently over the skyline, he pressed the intercom and delivered words that froze the cabin. "This is the captain. Brace for impact." Passengers who moments earlier were texting loved ones or staring out at the winter sun now snapped into dread. Flight attendants echoed the command, their voices steady but urgent. "Brace, brace! Heads down! Stay down!" The cabin transformed in an instant. Armrests were gripped so tightly that knuckles turned white. Parents pulled children close. A few whispered prayers, others mouthed them silently. A businessman in the aisle seat closed his eyes and squeezed the hand of the stranger beside him. The smell of smoke lingered from the engines, mingling with the sharp chill of winter air pushing through the vents. Time slowed, every heartbeat stretching. For those on board, the terror came not just from the thought of hitting water, but from the unknown that followed. Could the jet remain intact? Would the fuselage split open? Would the wings tear off and drag the plane under? Aviation experts had long warned that ditching a jet was almost always fatal, a last resort in manuals rarely practiced in reality. The Hudson was wide, but it had no runway, and the water that January afternoon was near freezing. Even if the landing worked, survival in the current was far from guaranteed. Yet in the cockpit, there was no panic. Sully focused on airspeed, pitch, and angle of descent. First Officer Jeffrey Skiles kept calling out checklists, giving structure to the chaos. Behind them, 155 lives hung on the precision of one approach. As the shoreline blurred past and the river drew closer, a single question loomed over every soul on board. Could a commercial airliner, stripped of power, really survive a direct hit on the Hudson? The answer would not come until metal met water. And in those last seconds, with silence inside the cabin and the city looking on, the fate of a Flight 1549 balanced on a razor's edge. To onlookers along Manhattan's west side, the sight was unreal. A full-size passenger jet descending low over the skyline, not toward an airport, but straight for the water. At 3:31 p.m., the moment of truth arrived. The tail of Flight 1549 skimmed the river first, striking with a violent splash. Instead of breaking apart, the fuselage held. The belly followed, sliding hard across the icy current, sending up a spray that glittered in the winter sun. Then the wings leveled, acting like outriggers, steadying the jet as it slowed. The sound of metal tearing never came. Incredibly, the aircraft stayed intact. Investigators later said the pitch and speed were near perfect, about 144 miles per hour, with the nose raised just under 10 degrees. Any steeper or flatter, and the story might have ended in disaster. Inside, the impact threw passengers forward, but the cabin did not collapse. People braced against seats, then looked up to realize the impossible. They were alive, but the danger wasn't over. The fuselage had been breached, and freezing water began rushing in. The Hudson in January measures barely above 36 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to induce hypothermia in minutes. Passengers scrambled for life vests, some yanking cushions from under seats, others fumbling with emergency straps as the cabin filled with the roar of rushing water. Flight attendants shouted instructions, forcing open doors and slides, guiding people toward the overwing exits. One of the most striking images of the day came moments later. Dozens of survivors standing shoulder to shoulder on the wings of the A320, balancing carefully on slick metal, their breath visible in the frigid air. Behind them, the Manhattan skyline rose in disbelief, as if the city itself was watching. Rescue was already racing across the river. Ferries that usually carried commuters to New Jersey changed course the instant they saw the jet. The Thomas Jefferson was among the first to arrive, pulling up alongside the plane. Crews tossed ropes and life rings, dragging shivering passengers aboard. Others pulled people directly from rafts or out of the icy water. Soon more ferries crowded in, followed by Coast Guard cutters and fireboats, their sirens cutting through the winter haze. Every passenger and crew member was evacuated. Not a single life was lost. For aviation experts, it was a scenario once thought unthinkable. A large jet ditching in open water with every soul surviving. Yet here it was, playing out on live television and captured in photographs that would circle the globe. In just minutes, an ordinary Airbus had gone from powerless descent to floating lifeboat. And for 155 people who expected the end, the Hudson River had become their unlikely runway, turning certain tragedy into a story of survival no one could forget. By the time dusk settled over Manhattan, Flight 1549 was already on every television screen in America. News choppers circled overhead, their lenses capturing an image so unbelievable that anchors struggled to find words. An Airbus A320, engines dead, was floating intact on the Hudson River. Passengers stood shivering on its wings, rescue boats pulling alongside. This wasn't wreckage, it was survival, and the world rushed to call it what it seemed to be, a miracle. CNN used the phrase first. Headlines soon echoed it across every outlet. Miracle on the Hudson. The New York Times marveled at the odds, writing that a jetliner had found a runway where none existed. The phrase stuck because no other description seemed to fit. In a decade marked by aviation tragedies, here was a story that ended differently, not in flames, but in hope. The image of the jet on the river became instantly iconic. It splashed across front pages from New York to Tokyo, the silver fuselage, the Manhattan skyline behind it, the dark current of the Hudson carrying the improbable raft downstream. Within hours, the photo was etched into memory as one of the most remarkable aviation images of the 21st century. At the center of it all was Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger. He became the face of the survival story, a man lifted by public gratitude into the role of national hero. Politicians lined up to praise him. President George W. Bush called to congratulate him in his final days in office. President-elect Barack Obama invited him and his crew to the inauguration in Washington. Parades in his honor drew crowds who wanted to see the man who had kept calm when panic should have won. Yet when Sully himself stepped before microphones, his words were strikingly modest. "I was just doing my job," he told reporters. Again and again, he deflected praise, insisting the credit belonged to the entire crew, to his first officer Jeffrey Skiles, to the flight attendants who managed the cabin, and even to the ferry operators who raced to the scene. He refused to let the story rest only on his shoulders, and that humility deepened the admiration of millions. The miracle on the Hudson became more than a headline. It was shorthand for survival against impossible odds, a phrase invoked whenever courage and calm turned disaster into triumph. The sight of a jetliner afloat in a winter river reminded people that sometimes the extraordinary happens, not through luck alone, but through training, teamwork, and a decision made in seconds that saved 155 lives. Once the headlines faded, the investigation began. The National Transportation Safety Board wasted no time securing the wreckage. Barges and cranes lifted the battered Airbus from the Hudson, dripping with icy water. Divers swept the riverbed, eventually recovering both destroyed engines. What they found confirmed the crew's testimony. A flock of Canada geese had struck the aircraft with devastating force. The physical evidence was clear. Feathers, tissue, and DNA samples taken from the turbines matched Canada geese, each weighing around 10 pounds. That single detail mattered more than most people realized. Jet engines are certified to withstand birds up to 4 pounds, ducks, gulls, smaller waterfowl, but these geese were more than double that size. It was a scenario the certification process had never truly accounted for, and it exposed a gap in how aviation regulators tested safety. From the wreckage, investigators also pulled the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. Both were intact, and the data they revealed matched Sully's account step for step. The checklists, the calls, the timing, every action was validated. The black boxes turned what might have been a story of instinct into proof of discipline. They showed how, in under 4 minutes, the crew had run through critical procedures while keeping control of a powerless jet gliding over Manhattan. But one question dominated public debate. Could the plane have made it back to LaGuardia or even Teterboro? To answer it, the NTSB ran dozens of simulator tests. In the first scenarios, pilots immediately turned back after the bird strike. Under those unrealistic conditions, already primed for the emergency, some landed safely. But when investigators introduced just 35 seconds of delay to mimic real-world decision-making, every simulated attempt failed. Planes fell short, crashing into neighborhoods or breaking apart on approach. In those tests, only one option led to survival: the river. Another critical detail surfaced. In the cockpit recording, Sully can be heard starting the auxiliary power unit, the small onboard generator that restores electricity when engines fail. By engaging it almost immediately, he kept flight computers, instruments, and hydraulic controls online. Without it, the Airbus could have lost stability protections and entered a stall, plummeting uncontrollably. The NTSB highlighted this decision as one of the defining reasons Flight 1549 remained flyable until impact. By the end of the hearings, the probable cause was officially declared: bird ingestion into both engines. But the deeper truth was more striking. This was not just a miracle, it was the result of human judgment, simulator-proven choices, and a captain's instinct to act without hesitation. Behind the headlines, the investigation revealed that survival had hinged on seconds, on a switch flipped at the right time, and on a river that became the only runway left. In the months after Flight 1549, investigators and the public turned their attention to the danger few passengers ever think about: birds. What happened over New York wasn't a freak one-off. It was part of a larger pattern, one that aviation experts had been warning about for years. Bird strikes, when birds collide with aircraft, happen far more often than most people realize. According to the FAA, over 14,000 strikes are reported every year in the United States alone, and while most result in little more than dents or delays, the consequences can be catastrophic when large birds meet jet engines at high speeds. Since 1988, more than 200 people worldwide have died in accidents linked directly to bird strikes, a sobering reminder that nature can cripple even the most advanced machines. History provides grim examples. In 1996, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 was hijacked and forced to attempt a ditching in the Indian Ocean after fuel exhaustion. While not caused by birds, it became a case study in how unforgiving water landings usually are. The NTSB drew parallels when analyzing Flight 1549, noting that most ditchings in history ended in heavy loss of life. Another tragedy tied directly to bird strikes was Eastern Airlines. Flight 375 in 1960, which crashed into Boston Harbor after striking a flock of starlings on takeoff, killing 62 people. Such cases underline why Sully's landing was so extraordinary. It wasn't just rare, it went against decades of data suggesting survival was nearly impossible. Other comparisons reinforce the danger. Swissair Flight 111 in 1998, though not a bird strike, highlighted how long, complex checklists can overwhelm crews in sudden emergencies. In contrast, Sully and Skiles had only minutes, yet their ability to prioritize, cutting to the essentials, starting the APU early, stabilizing the glide, proved decisive. Experts pointed out that in crises involving birds, hesitation is fatal. Unlike a mechanical failure that develops slowly, a bird strike is instantaneous. Pilots go from full thrust to silence in seconds. Then there was the bird itself, the Canada goose. These aren't small gulls or pigeons. The geese Flight 1549 struck were double or even triple the weight regulators planned for. It was an overload scenario no certification test had modeled, which explains why both engines failed completely. Why are there so many geese near airports today? Ironically, part of the answer lies in environmental policy. After the banning of DDT in the 1970s, waterfowl populations across North America rebounded dramatically. Canada geese, once declining, multiplied in parks, golf courses, and wetlands near expanding cities. By the 2000s, their numbers in the US had exploded into the millions. For aviation, that meant flocks the size of airborne hazards lingering in flight paths, particularly near urban hubs like New York. In response to the Hudson River landing, airports nationwide stepped up wildlife management. LaGuardia and JFK expanded patrols, invested in radar systems that track bird flocks, and even employed border collies to chase geese from runways. The FAA funneled millions into programs designed to thin populations around airports, yet the risk hasn't gone away. Birds migrate, adapt, and multiply, and every year thousands still collide with airplanes. Flight 1549 revealed that even in an age of advanced avionics and modern engines, one of aviation's oldest enemies, a bird in the sky, can still bring a jetliner to its knees. And while Sully's decision turned a potential tragedy into a miracle, the larger question remains: how many more hidden risks are circling just beyond the runway? What could be done to stop it from happening again? Airports across the United States rushed to tighten their defenses. At New York's LaGuardia, wildlife management crews stepped up patrols. Geese were trapped, relocated, and in many cases culled outright. Specialized systems called avian radar were installed at major hubs, able to track flocks on screens the way air traffic controllers track planes. Runway zones were cleared of ponds, grass, and waste that attracted birds. Other airports introduced falconry units and even border collies trained to chase birds from takeoff paths. The message was clear: wildlife needed to be kept far from turbine engines. But the investigation into Flight 1549 revealed more than an ecological challenge. It exposed gaps in pilot training. Commercial pilots practice countless emergencies in simulators: engine failures, hydraulic losses, decompression events. Yet one maneuver was rarely, if ever, rehearsed: ditching on water. Training manuals assumed it was almost always fatal. Sully himself later told investigators that he had never practiced a water landing in an Airbus simulator. What made the difference was his background. As a former US Air Force pilot, he had logged hours in gliders, learning the delicate balance of speed, pitch, and lift. Those instincts, coupled with a near-obsessive dedication to procedure, allowed him to keep the Airbus level long enough to pull off the impossible. For the industry, the lesson was unavoidable. Flight 1549 became a mandatory case study in safety seminars and pilot courses worldwide. Airlines dissected the cockpit decisions from Skiles' attempt at engine restarts to Sully's early start of the auxiliary power unit. They studied how seconds of hesitation might have doomed the flight and how crew resource management, the calm division of duties in chaos, turned panic into survival. The event underscored that heroism wasn't about instinct alone, but about preparation, communication, and training, drilled until it became reflex. Yet even as simulators grew more advanced and checklists more refined, the story of Flight 1549 carried a humbling reminder. Nature is not bound by certification tests or regulations. A 10-pound Canada goose multiplied into a flock can overpower turbines designed for smaller impacts. Technology cannot erase that risk. At best, it can help crews survive it. The Hudson River landing stood as a live demonstration, not just of a pilot's skill, but of aviation's eternal truth. No matter how advanced the machines, the sky will always belong, in part, to nature. And sometimes survival comes down to respecting that balance. In the end, Flight 1549 became more than a near disaster. It became a story of survival against impossible odds. 155 lives were saved because of a decision made in seconds and the steady hands of a captain who refused to panic when everything went silent. The world called it the miracle on the Hudson. For the survivors, it was the moment they stepped off a wing into rescue boats instead of into headlines of tragedy. For the public, it turned Captain Chesley Sully Sullenberger into a national hero. His story later reached Hollywood in Clint Eastwood's Sully, with Tom Hanks bringing his calm, quiet resolve to the screen. But the legacy went far beyond fame. Aviation engineers began improving jet engines to withstand larger birds, knowing Canada geese, often weighing up to 14 pounds, posed threats well beyond the certification standards. Airports expanded wildlife control, adding avian radar and reshaping habitats to keep flocks away from runways. And in training rooms around the world, Flight 1549 became a permanent case study, proof that skill, teamwork, and judgment in the span of half a minute can save hundreds of lives. The lesson remains clear. No matter how advanced aviation technology becomes, nature still holds power over the skies. And when that power collides with human machines, survival depends on the people inside the cockpit. The miracle on the Hudson stands as a reminder that discipline, preparation, and calm under pressure can turn disaster into triumph. But here's the question that lingers. If you were on that flight and heard the words "brace for impact," what would you think? Share your answer in the comments and subscribe to MindGap to uncover more mysteries, miracles, and untold truths of our world.